All right. For this one, let's go over the concept of a perfect verb and how we can form them from the imperfect verbs we already know, and then how to put them how to put perfect verbs into future tense. So, perfect verbs imply a completed action, unlike the imperfect verbs, which imply a continuous or recurring action. Now, do we know any perfect verbs already? Vast majority of the verbs I've introduced so far have been imperfect, but I think you have been exposed to a couple of them. One of them is сделать, which means to do, but can also be translated as to have done, specifically to emphasize the completion aspect. And another one is сказать, which is to say or to tell, but can also be translated as to have said or to have told, again, to emphasize the completion aspect. Uh, Now, one way which we can form the perfect verbs from the imperfect verbs we know, and this is a general guideline, not a consistent rule, so there will be exceptions, is that perfect verbs can be formed from imperfect verbs by adding prefixes. And these prefixes will change the meaning, sometimes slightly, and sometimes very significantly, of the resulting verb. Let's take a look at some examples. So we already know that the verb делать, which is an imperfect verb, it means to do, and it can also be translated as to be doing because it implies a continuous or recurring action. But if we add a prefix po, po, or pronounced pa in the whole word, поделать, it means to have done some. Right now, maybe at the moment, it's difficult to imagine why you would use it. Imagine when you are working on some task, you haven't completed the task, but you did some work toward the task. This would be a good opportunity to use the verb поделать. In the past tense, it would be поделал. Also, there is сделать, which I already went over. This time we're adding the prefix s, and it becomes сделать. There's also another prefix we can add, which is при. It becomes приделать, which means to have attached. Let's take another verb, думать, which means to be thinking. It's an imperfect verb. And we add a prefix по, and it becomes подумать. Now, if поделать is to have done some, what do you think подумать means? Well, it says it right there. It means to have thought some. Like maybe you thought some about some, some dilemma or some problem, some solution, whatever topic you think about. You took some time to think about it. This would be a good opportunity to use the verb подумать. Now, what if we attach the same prefix as we did for приделать to the verb думать, and it becomes придумать? What we end up with is a verb that means to have come up with a thought towards some objective. So that's like a long definition, but if we think about it, that's a good verb to use when coming up with a solution. Or yeah, that's actually that's off the top of my head. That's the best opportunity is to use it when have thought of to have thought of a particular solution. Let's take another imperfect verb, играть, which means to be playing. We can add some prefixes to it, and the meaning in this case will actually change significantly, but it still will apply to the concept of playing. We have проиграть, проиграть, which means to have lost. We have выиграть, which means to have won. We have сыграть, which means to have played a complete unit of playing, um, or a complete unit, I just could have said. It could be a game, a match, whatever, some unit of playing. Um, it means to play through that completely. So this prefix s, it has this implication of something being completed. So these are examples of how we can take our imperfect verbs and attach prefixes to them, and they become perfect. And sometimes the meaning changes a little bit, and sometimes the meaning changes a lot. Okay, so what are these common prefixes? We're not going to go over them. There are maybe 10 or 15 of them. We'll go with some of the more common ones. So the prefix po often indicates a movement or an action starting. It can also imply a single occurrence or to do some, but not necessarily all of the action. So here we have examples. We already know that есть means to be eating. So поесть means to have eaten some. Поиграть means to have played some. Поделать means to have done some. We also have a prefix pri, which suggests the idea of arrival or approaching or connecting something to something. So uh, приделать, as I went over, is to attach, and придумать is to come up with something mentally. Uh, Not immediately obvious here, not immediately intuitive how the idea of attaching would uh, work with the verb to think. So that's why I say these prefixes are generic guidelines only. They can't really be relied on to definitively always reveal to you the meaning of a new verb. And let's go up over another prefix, s. It implies to do something to completion. So I already went over сделать, to do something to completion. Съесть. So we have our verb есть, and then in this case we'll be applying also the hard sign, твердый знак, and it becomes съесть, which means to completely eat something, to have eaten something completely. And we have сыграть, as I already went over, which means to play a complete game or match. So they generally make imperfect verbs perfect, or at least in our case, the imperfect verbs that we know. Um, the meaning of the newly made verb is not always obvious, as I already said. Sometimes prefixes will give us a good idea of the verb, of what the new verb could mean, but sometimes it's sometimes it's going to be just a new verb. So, for example, we know that знать means to know or to be knowing. So, what could possibly признать mean if при has a connotation of attaching something to something? Well, it turns out that признать means to admit. What does that have to do with attaching? I don't know. But that's what I mean when I say that the new meaning that we get by attaching the prefix will not always be obvious. But it does help. It does help to know these prefixes. Um, Often enough, they will give us a good educated guess on what the new verb could mean. All right, now let's go over the conjugations of the regular verbs that end on at for various pronouns. And there's a reason why we do this. But first, let's go over them just to have it fresh in our mind. And I got this from the old slide where I have capitalized the letters that get the accent, though it is missing in some places. But that's not as important because we will be focusing on the endings here. So we have the verb думать, and to conjugate it to я, it becomes я думаю, ты думаешь, we are adding ешь, вы думаете, он, она, оно думает, мы думаем, они думают. Notice this conjugation is very consistent for other verbs like знать, понимать, and I have not put them on this chart, but it's also consistent for the verbs делать and for the verb играть. So we will need to know this because of how we make future tense for perfect verbs. So I already went over imperfect verbs in a different lesson, and if you recall, the process of making future tense for imperfect verbs is in conjugating the verb быть for pronouns and then adding the imperfect verb in the indefinite form. So, for example, я буду делать, I will be doing. But perfect verbs, the ones that we're talking about right now, they work differently, very differently. And to put them into future tense, we will simply conjugate them. I intended this to be one them. Conjugate them to the pronoun like you do to the root imperfect verb, and it becomes future. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, so here we have the root imperfect verb, делать. Now conjugated by itself, я делаю, which would be the full one would be я делаю, which means I am doing. But now look what happens. Look what happens when it is an imperfect verb. Сделаю. So if we had сделать, which is imperfect, we now conjugate it just like we do the root verb, which is делаю. So сделать becomes сделаю, and it means I will do. Because it's an imperfect verb, when we conjugate it to a pronoun, it now implies future. So perfect verbs conjugated to pronouns imply future. Okay? Imperfect verbs conjugated to pronouns imply present tense, continuous action in present tense. Perfect verbs conjugated to pronouns become in future tense. So сделаю becomes I will do. Do to completion, as we went over the meaning of the verbs делать. Now, remember what приделать means? It means to attach. So what do you think приделаю means? Or to state it completely, я приделаю. It means I will attach. Okay, how about this one? Do you remember what играть means? It means to play. Do you remember what проиграть means? It means to lose. So what do you think it means? Now, проиграть is now a perfect verb. So when we conjugate it to a pronoun, it implies, or to any subject, it implies future. So what do you think они не проиграют means? Yeah, they will not lose. Future. Okay? We're conjugating a perfect verb, and in that conjugated form, it becomes future. How's that? Very different, right? For imperfect verbs, it's one thing. For perfect verbs, it's the other thing. The good news is we get to practice this. Yeah, starting now. I will not lose. For all these, by the way, for all these exercises, let's use the perfect verbs that we have just learned. So I will not lose. Я не проиграю. Я не проиграю. I will not lose to him. Do you remember how to say to him? We say it just by saying him in the dative case. All right, I'll give you a hint. Well, I'll just tell you it's ему. I will not lose to him. Я не проиграю ему. Or you can also say я ему не проиграю. Russian is flexible like that. Will you win tomorrow? Informal. So for this, you have to know which verb that we just gone over means to win, and then you need to conjugate it to the second person informal. And I hope you remember what it means to say tomorrow. Will you win tomorrow? Ты выиграешь завтра. Ты выиграешь завтра. Do you see why it's выиграешь? Выиграть means to win, and then when we conjugate it, just like when we conjugate it for the singular for second person, it becomes in the future. Okay. I think I meant to say we instead of having will. I think I meant to say we will. We will have it done better. Now, I'd say have it done. I could have also said we will do it better, but I wanted to emphasize the completed, that something will be done completely. Do you remember that verb to do something completely? Well, that's the verb you will need to conjugate for we. We will have it done better. And I hope you remember how to say better. Мы сделаем это лучше. Мы сделаем это лучше. She will think of a solution. Yeah, let's use one of those verbs that I said is the derivative of the verb думать, which is to come up with like a solution or some thought. And the word for solution is решение. Решение. Она придумает решение. Она придумает решение. Will you attach it? Informal. Ты приделаешь это? Ты приделаешь это? When will you do everything? This is formal. Now, for the verb, for the word everything, let's use все. Let's use все. And in this case, it would be appropriate to use the verb that implies to do something completely, because somebody will be doing everything, so we're implying that they'll be doing things completely. Um, so knowing all that, how would you say, uh, when will you do everything? And also for the most natural word order, uh, structure your words to correspond to when will you everything do. Когда вы все сделаете. Когда вы все сделаете. Okay, that concludes our slide, our practice.